Let's recap. You know that residential real estate was ground zero for this crisis and for the recessions of 2008, 2009. You also know that it was brought on by the low interest rates that stimulated residential real estate and then the subsequent collapse in the residential real estate market. You also know that one of the signs of the boom was the big run-up in private borrowing, and a key emblem of the collapse is the contraction in private borrowing as the economy has shrunk. All right, so ask yourself this question. If our economy depends on spending, and we all know it does, and if our economy depends on the borrowing that makes that spending possible, and we know that's true, and we've seen it, then if that borrowing shrinks and if that spending shrinks, what's going to make up the difference to alleviate the effects of this crisis? Clearly, there has to be some kind of borrowing and spending that's going to take place to make up for what we've lost. And that is the federal government. So if you take a look, like I am right now, at chart 7.1, you can see the effects of the recession on the federal government, and you can also see what the federal government is doing about it. So let's take a look at chart 7.1, and let's make sure we know what we're looking at. The scale is in billions of dollars, and sure enough, we've got thousands out here. So as you know, 1,000 billion is a trillion. So we've got a trillion, we've got 2 trillion, we've got 3 trillion. And you'll see also the lines which represent federal government receipts, federal government expenditures, the surplus or the deficit. How does this work? Quite simple. The red line is expenditures. The blue line is receipts or revenues. So anytime the red line, which is of course the expenditures, is greater than the blue line, which is the receipts, we must be running a deficit. And therefore this green line, which will show either surplus or deficit, that is below zero anytime the expenditures are greater than the receipts. On the other hand, on that brief and rare occasion around the year 2000, when the revenues were actually greater than the expenditures, you can see that momentary surplus right there around the year 2000 when the green line rose above zero. All right. Well, what's happening today? Well, clearly what's happening today, if we fast forward to current events, is expenditures keep growing. Well, that's all part of the stimulus package. We all know that the federal government is now going to spend more in order to stimulate the economy. But what about the tax cuts? Well, the tax cuts and the recession itself clearly have reduced federal revenues. So expenditures going north, revenues heading south. Sure enough, you can see the federal deficit getting larger and larger. Now, what does federal deficit mean? Federal deficit means more federal borrowing. So as private borrowing shrinks, which is emblematic of private spending shrinking, the federal government has to step in, fill the gap. It has to increase its own spending. But the federal government can't just increase its own spending while it reduces our spending. So the only way the federal government can make its programs effective is to increase its spending without reducing ours. And that means the federal government has to reduce taxes even as it's boosting its own spending. That means more deficits. So as the private borrowing shrinks, the federal borrowing rises. And we are in for some record deficits, as you all know. But don't think of them in a vacuum. Think of them as compensating for the drop in private borrowing and spending.